Hey everybody, it's Bishop Megan and I'm here for a conversation about ways that we can learn from the full diversity of folk who are in our Lutheran Church. And tonight's conversation is with someone I have known for a couple of decades and is one of my favorite people in the world. Vance, will you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you, Bishop. I am Vance Blackfox. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, a longtime friend of Bishop Megan, and have worked for the church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, served the church, I should say, in a variety of capacities. I was a teenager, and most recently just was hired not too long ago to serve as the Desk Director for the American Indian and Alaska Native Tribal Nations. So I'm excited.
Yay, welcome back.
Thank you. But have served in a variety of capacities, Augsburg Fortress Publishers and Cal Lutheran and, Lutheran School of Theology, Chicago, and so all over the place. And now happy to be back here and happy to be here with you. Thank you.
Yay. Well, I am currently on the traditional and unceded land of the Ohlone people. I grew up in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which is the traditional and unceded land of the Lakota and the Dakota people. And my family's farm is in Pipestone, the very sacred land of many people who quarry their stone for making peace pipes. And so have a very long journeyed history with the land and places that are rented and leased and lived upon, but not all the way back to those kind of ancient origins. I am a graduate of Augustana University in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And so as a part of earning your degree at that university, at least during the time I was there, you were required to take Native American Studies as a part of your humanities degree. And I had the wonderful privilege of having Martin Brokenleg as one of my mentors. Wow. Because I was the president of the LGBTQ Alliance, and he was the advisor of that organization. So that's some of the coattails of different places that I have been, and the lands that I have dwelt upon for a while.
It's fantastic. Yeah. Well, I'm here in San Antonio, Texas. San Antonio. Well, I grew up in Oklahoma, a very tiny town called Oaks. It is in the heart of what's now become the Cherokee Nation and the state of Oklahoma. But it's the original lands of the Caddo people and the Osage people. And now I've made San Antonio home, which is the original lands of the Coetecan and Tonkawa peoples. And so, very special place for those people here in my heart. And thankful that I get to share this land with them now, that they're sharing it with me, I should say. So, yeah. Oh, also in Augustana, right? I mean, I could go into a whole lecture, history lesson about Augustana, Sioux Falls, and the American Indian movement, and the Tri-Lutheran church bodies, and all those things, tribe and multi. We want that. That's another presentation, maybe. But yeah,
we'll invite all the Augustana people to come be a part of that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I'll be visiting Augustana in October, and so. It will be an interesting journey to go back, and so we'll see what happens with all of that. Would you be willing to share some of the intersections that you embody and how that shapes your faith a little bit?
Absolutely. So I am first and foremost, I am Cherokee. So I say I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation because we are a political people, not Cherokee, but Native people are a political people by virtue of being Native and being born in this particular country. And that's a whole nother lecture too, I suppose. But I am Cherokee, I'm Chalagi, Anikadua would be the name for ourselves. And happy to, I'm very proud to be all those things. But first and foremost, I can't change anything about myself in regard to that part of me. The other thing I can't change also, however, is being Two-Spirit. So I am Two-Spirit. And my history, the history of my journey in the church, funny enough, has allowed me actually the privilege of having always been Two-Spirit. And what I mean by that is I knew what Two-Spiritism was probably before I knew what gay really meant, and that there is, for many of us, a difference between two-spirit and gay. And so I certainly identify as two-spirit rather than gay. And I am a lifelong Lutheran, having been missionized as a little one, but my family's heritage is for 100 years is Lutheran, and before that, 100 years of Moravianism because of missionization. And I am a descendant of boarding school survivors. Both my grandmothers or two of my grandmothers and many of my aunties went to boarding school. I am a justice seeker and a peacemaker. I do my best to do those things in all the places that I am. And I am an Indigenous theologian. I have the privilege of studying theology at the alma mater of Vine Deloria Jr, who was an alum of the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. Well, actually a predecessor school, but we claim him. And so I get to be the creator and producer of the Vine Deloria Jr Theological Symposium every November. So mark your calendars, November 16 and 17 this year, virtual. So be watching for those announcements in the next few days. And I am from a matriarchal matrilineal people. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that I am the son of Anita, the grandson of Sharon, the great-grandson of Oklahoma, the great-great-grandson of Bertha, the great-great-great-grandson of Anna. And so just really I'm proud of those women and thankful for them and grateful for them for passing down to me all the things that I might need to do what I need to do here on this journey. So, it's so funny because you ask, how does it affect my faith life? And as a person who has always known themselves to be Christian, a Lutheran Christian in particular, and having been a leader in the church from a very early age, I don't know anything but this amazing gift of grace. I think that this gift of grace is very freeing and very appropriate. And I just think that the theology that we get to espouse and that we get to share and that we get to live into and live out in this world as Lutherans is pretty fantastic and fits me very well. It also, as an Indigenous person, an Indigenous theologian, I'm constantly saying, I can't think of a better fit for Indigenous people than this grace theology that we inherited from Luther and others along the way. And so, so those are the intersections, and my existence here is tied up both being a Native person, Indigenous person, and my lens is always that, even when I'm talking about theology. So I say I'm an Indigenous theologian because I don't do theology any other way. I can't. I think a lot of folks want to force us to do it a particular way. And not only do I refuse, but it's not possible. And so, so those are the intersections, and that's how I fit in this place.
And that's one of my favorite things about you, is that you are, in my estimation, a very patient and compassionate person. You're also very much education driven, in that some people needing to share with others ways that they can be better in the world feels like an additional trauma that they take on. And it might be for you, but you do enough self-care work that it still is a part of your vocation. And it is with, I think, oftentimes kind of amount of just kind of, maybe it's like a wise stillness that you're able to sometimes help people kind of come into knowing what might be next on their journey of how to relate with people. And so I always appreciate the ways that you help unfold kind of some of the stuff that you are sharing with folk, but then also kind of some of the ways where you sometimes will just stop talking and then just sort of lean back until people kind of come into their own wisdom. And I appreciate that very much about you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And you have to insert that, some of it comes with maturity. I like to think that I was mature and wise from the very beginning, but I wasn't, and I had to grow into it. But I have to give the credit to both my mother, mostly my mother, for reminding me of the importance of being kind. And then I'm also being reminded almost daily by my brother and his compassion, his care for his employees and his family. So those two folks are great role models for me to do better every day, and how I teach people about who we are. So.
Well, would you be willing to share a little bit more about what it means to be transgender Two-Spirit, for those who maybe haven't heard the words Two-Spirit before? I'm transgenders, which is why it came out of my mouth, but it's not quite that, and it's not quite LGBTQ. It's another thing that is its own, and so I'm hoping that you will say some words about it that might lift up the charism for folk.
Sure. No, I appreciate that. I mentioned how I kind of always known what Two-Spirit was, and that I probably came out as I did come out as Two-Spirit to myself. But it's so funny because I from an early age, I knew there would be a challenge to explain what that was, and I even had to mature into understanding how to explain it as a young person. And so it was just easier to say I'm gay and come out as gay when I finally did in my late teen years. And so, but Two-Spirit really is defined for us as the third gender in Indigenous cultures. And some people say, well, there's also a fourth gender, and it depends upon the sociologist or the anthropologist or the psychologist, whomever wants to define us in certain ways. But basically, it's this new creation. And you can be a male-bodied Two-Spirit person or a female-bodied Two-Spirit person. And much of the time, the relationships are one that encompasses a homosexual relationship sexually. But then there's all, really the focus is the gender. So you would have historically and traditionally, and then even today in most tribes, or a lot of tribes, maybe not most, but it would be this man existence, this masculine spirit, and then you have a woman and this feminine spirit, and then the third gender and the Two-Spirit, which is obviously a contemporary term because each tribe had its own term for this being in their midst, was this Two-Spirit was the embodiment of both spirits. And it wasn't necessarily, like I said, about sexuality or sex. It was about the role that this third being in those, compared to the other two, played a special part. So historically, we know that, and even in some contemporary tribal situations today that are reclaiming then and re-embracing their Two-Spirit people, their Two-Spirit siblings and relatives, they held positions in roles and took on certain roles in their communities that were honored. In other words, they might have been identified as Two-Spirit as a child, but then raised and groomed to be that medicine person, or the wise person, or the teacher, or the story keepers, or the caregivers for children, and that would mostly have been the male-bodied Two-Spirit people, the male-bodied third gender people. And some of our tribal groups would have even had a special camp for the Two-Spirit people, because whether it was the separating and putting in a special camp, or just how we honored and revered Two-Spirit people traditionally, historically, it was about not separating them for the sake of their difference, but separating them because their medicine was so strong. Their medicine was strong. They didn't want to, the people who were not Two-Spirit didn't want to disrupt that medicine. Instead, they wanted to keep it sacred and honor it, and in any way that they, developed for themselves as a group of people to honor it. Oftentimes, a chief would marry a Two-Spirit male-bodied person. Oftentimes, the female-bodied Two-Spirit person might have been a warrior woman, or just a warrior, depending upon the term for that person in the tribe. And they took on the roles that was appropriate for them. And some of them and it varied. So maybe it was a male-bodied two-spirit person that took on more female roles and worked with the women, and of course, like the warrior women or the female-bodied two-spirit people, you know, they were out hunting with the men. But the marriage, in some instances, not all instances, but in some instances, the marriages or the coupling, if there was coupling for the two-spirit, was with someone of the same sex. The male-bodied two-spirit person would be married to a man, and a female-bodied two-spirit person would have married a woman. Again, that varied from tribe to tribe, maybe, but in many cases, that's how it happened. And so there is just this, today there's this reclamation, and it happened around 78 in the Bay Area, when the HIV and AIDS epidemic was beginning to get real out of control, and Native people who had left their tribal situations, their reservations or their tribal communities for the cities, that had actually been run off, right? They had been scared off. They'd been closeted or forcibly closeted and just couldn't anymore, and so went to places where they thought that they would be more safe from the things that were persecuting them. And the thing that was persecuting them the most in tribal situations was the Christianity, the Native people on the reservations, or the pastors or priests that were on the reservations would treat them terribly, or would, you know, try to convince them that it was sinful, or that it was wrong, or that they were an abomination, as we know, as the language is often used for us in those abusive situations. And so they would go to the cities, and so when those Native people began to then become ill, sick from disease, and or die from the disease, social workers and other medicine people and traditionalists and healthcare workers began talking about, well, what was this like? I mean, why is there so much separation for these people? And so they began talking to elders and talking to the gay natives, because that's what they only knew themselves as. And there was this reclamation of the third gender person in many of those communities, especially the urban communities. And so it just kind of grew from there, and then has since people have conversations with folks back on their reservations with elders, and they're like, yeah, there was always these third gender folks. There was always two-spirit folks. They were holy, right? There was a person who just recently shared a story with me. A friend of mine shared a story about an elder who he was at some event in Indian country. There was mostly Native people there, and they noticed that a person had walked in, and that person was someone that the community knew to be two-spirit, and the elder stood. And normally we stand for elders, right? Or we're looking at how we, make sure the elders have everything that they need. This elder stood when it was hard for them to stand, and my friend made a comment to him, and the elder says, "No, we got to stand when medicine walks in the door." And so to think about one, the closetedness that happened for us from the way back when Columbus and the explorers showed up, right? That's when it started. We were immediately the abomination, and so we were closeted a long time. But for generations and generations and millennia, we were the holy people, right? We were the people who were caring for the community in great ways. And then the work that had happened since 78 to reclaim, and the folks who are working so hard to educate younger natives about what it means. And there's still a difference for many of us between gay native and two-spirit, but we don't deny necessarily those younger folks who want to say they're gay, because that's maybe the culture they know, right? We don't want to block them or keep them from understanding. You also may be two-spirit, and want to learn, teach them and help them learn what that might be about, to enter back into the circle, because that's really what the movement's about, is to find our place back in that circle as medicine.
Well, I have appreciated over my time in faithful research and in my own discernment, my own vocation, certainly when there were times when people said, no, there must be only two genders, or there must be only this way of having a family. And I remember for myself to be able to read some of the narratives about folk from the most ancient of times having had similar ways of living or expansive ways of living, even if they weren't the same as mine, for me was always something that gave me life and breath. However, as someone who could only read the stories in English, you had to wade through so much muck of just vile anthropology that named people in ways that you knew wasn't right. And so to be able to find kind of other kindred who have gender diversity or to have sexuality diversity, but also to be named as sacred from these really kind of ancient movements, maybe pre-movements of being colonized, to just have one kind of fearful way of understanding God. It took a lot of work of sifting through what was baggage and what was the history that was underneath. And so because I kind of had to read it through foggy glasses that had clear bias in the writings, it's for me really wonderful to be able to speak with you about some of the ways that there's older knowledge and older wisdom and older gender diversity. And because some of the most hateful things people say to me is about like, oh, this is just a new thing that y'all are inventing kind of in these new days. And so I find real strength and support from kind of learning some of these older, more traditional ancient stories that have been in the world. And you've spoken a little bit about how people tried to violently teach this out of community. I think there's a direct correlation between colonization and some of these very rigid sex and gender constructions. I wonder if maybe speaking a little bit more about the boarding school harm that happened might be a way of speaking about that a little more.
Sure, absolutely. I like to think, and I always want to make the assumption that people just know that, the doctrine of discovery, this permission or even order, if you will, that came from the papal bull, the Pope, put out to the world in the 1450s, and then again in the 1493, once the Europeans had really reached the Turtle Island in South America, or what became South America. That part of that was, most of it was to take our land, but the other part was to give permission to enslave people and to create tactics by which to make folks Christian, to trick them out of their land. So it was all economics, and the church certainly was a part of that at the time. It continues to be a part of it, quite frankly, in certain ways, as we live out the doctrine of discovery and all that is the church, both Catholic and Protestant. But one of the ways in which the doctrine of discovery lived itself out, one of the ways in which the colonial project attempted to annihilate, decimate Native people or Indigenous peoples in the United States and Canada in particular, were the eras and the policies of in Canada, residential schools for Indians or Natives, and in the United States we call Indian boarding schools. So they're the same concept, but the same desire to eliminate people, but they're called different things because that's what's written in the policy, the federal policy. In the United States, the policy was around for about 100 years, from about 1879 until about 1972, I believe it is, that there was a federal policy that said that it was okay for the federal government to go into reservations or Indigenous communities, Native communities, and take children and force them to go to federally run or federally funded boarding schools. And so this for 100 years. And before that happened, there was probably day schools on most reservations that were run by churches. And then the federal government started giving money to those day schools to help the assimilation process. And then eventually they became boarding schools, but they couldn't keep the children on boarding schools, at the boarding school on campus. So because they could just run away or go home, or their parents would come and take them or whatever, and just they weren't being successful in their assimilation project if they were on the reservation. So they created then a system of off-reservation boarding schools, which is really what the boarding school policies funded. And so the first being in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And the practice was to take the child to the boarding school, a boarding school that was hundreds or thousands of miles away from their home, so that then they couldn't run away or go home. And again, the policy was to support the process of assimilation, forced assimilation of Native children, so as to make them not Native, but white. And the mantra became, kill the Indian, save the man. And they did that in many ways, using many tactics. The education that they were receiving was more of a trades education, and so they were taught to be farmers, or to take care of the home, or to sew, or to be a mechanic, and that changed over that century's time, depending upon the institution. Some children who went to boarding school will say they had a positive experience, or they were thankful because it provided food that their families didn't have on the reservation. And shelter and warmth or whatever. Some will say they had a good experience because they did get a decent education and gave them a head start to go on to do successful things in their lives. But the majority of children who went to boarding schools that were forced to go, who were kidnapped, separated from their families, and taken these boarding schools, they did experience trauma from all the abusive militaristic style of education and formation of children. There was no tenderness by many of the matrons or patrons or priests or pastors or other employees, because they were to be trained to be a particular type of person, and it wasn't meant to be soft. And at the same time, they were espousing Christian beliefs. They were assimilating, not only just their being, taking away their identity, but they were reinserting it with the Christianity. That to me seems a bit odd, that you would abuse children and punish them in the ways that they were punished, and then speak, about how good Jesus is. Now, when I say punished, we're talking about deep abuse. We're talking about abuse that some people never recovered from. We're talking about rape. We're talking about molestation. We're talking about beatings. We're talking about teaching the other children to punish another child. So in other words, many times the child who needed to be punished was actually punished by their peers under the order of the headmaster or whomever was running the school. And so that was not the beginning, but certainly a major portion of why Christianity became so prevalent. So the kids would go back home after they graduated, or was finished or whatever, and they'd go home, and they were no longer, they were assimilated. They couldn't relate to the family at home. The family couldn't relate to them necessarily, and so they became desperate. And their faith then was Christian, and they didn't know how to be traditional or be a part of the ceremonies or rituals because they hadn't been exposed to them for many years, and so it became desperation. A lot of folks are stereotype Native peoples as drunks and addicts. Well, we are drunks and addicts, a lot of us, because there was this trauma. There's desperation, this hopelessness. So they send us home with the promise of, we're trained to do all these wonderful things, but then they would send us home to reservations where there was no place for them to do these things or any money to be spent on the things that they were trained to do. So there was no jobs, and then they just, the hopelessness took them to places where they needed to escape. And on the reservation, well, that's drugs and alcohol, right? In many cases, that's the only thing to create their escape, in addition to suicide, which is also a pandemic for us in any country. So all that to say, the only thing that those who have not gone that route, most of them then only knew Christianity as their spiritual life, their connection to Jesus. And then that was kind of an odd situation for many, I would say. I can generalize that way. But that then compounded the message of what's right and what's wrong, which wasn't in line. The Christian message of what's right and what's wrong much of the time isn't in line with what Native people believe to be okay and healthy and spiritual and balanced, like two-spiritism and a third gender or fourth gender or fifth gender or sixth gender, right? And then so Native people began attacking Native people under the word of God. You are sinful, you are bad, you gotta live this certain way in many of our tribal communities. And so that also then compounded the desperation, the hopelessness. So it's just a big cycle. And then they have children, these folks who come in from boarding schools, children, and they pass, and they don't know, they've never been parented because they were in military school from the time they were babies, much of them, or many of them. And so they didn't know how to parent their children. And so it just got passed down through the generations, this desperation in many cases. And then again, the only thing to turn to for hope is the church. And then the church is still espousing these things are not in balance with what our traditional beliefs are. So so boarding schools. And some of you may have heard that, they're discovering, well, guess what? We're not discovering anything. We've always known that the mass graves and that the unmarked graves at these boarding schools of these thousands and thousands and thousands of children who were killed by disease, maybe in some instances, but also killed at the hands of the people running the schools, the church.
Yeah, and there are, if you all have not been to any of them, there are some that have been preserved in South Dakota, in Minnesota, and in several places that are preserved in the same way that we would preserve a concentration camp or a place where you want to kind of learn to never do this again. You can walk through them and learn about tactics of shame that were used, the way they would use haircuts as punishments, and ways of just shaming people that is hard for people to imagine is the depths that you can treat people, let alone children, unless you kind of go through and see some of, like, they had to invent things in order to torture people the way that they tortured people. And you can, sometimes when you see them and you touch them, you get a sense of the reality of it in a way that remembers the story viscerally, in addition to just kind of knowing that things have happened. I know that there was some information that came out not too long ago from churchwide about helping congregations kind of have things that they can do in response to kind of these new discoveries, or maybe burials that get to be buried properly now. Do you have a sense that there are tangible things that can be done? My hunch is probably not in quick or swift ways.
Maybe not quick or swift ways, right? But certainly, right, or certainly things that folks can be a part of. And first, let me say that in Canada, right, they're ahead of the game compared to the United States. We're a little lazy in the United States. We like our privilege here much more than they like theirs there, maybe. I don't know. But whatever the case is in Canada, there was 160 boarding schools, somewhere there in the hundreds, just between 100 and 200 schools. In the United States, we know for a fact that there were probably more than 367. Now the research has been done by the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. A couple of researchers in particular who were friends. That's a lot of schools, and they had hundreds, if not thousands, of students go through there. So the numbers are big, right? And we've not even begun to investigate the graves, the unmarked graves, or the mass graves here. But yes, I think there are ways. So I think you may be alluding to the letter that came from the American Indian Alaska Native Lutheran Association about the time that some of the Canadian schools or Canadian natives began talking about and finding or locating, I should say, the mass graves and the unmarked graves there. And there's a day, and I'll be promoting that from my office, and so you folks there in the synods will get this information. But there's an Orange Shirt Day to commemorate the children who were forced to go to boarding school. Both those pay attention to those who didn't make it home, but also to honor those who did and who are considered survivors of boarding school. And so when the graves were being located, and it was obvious it was going to be hundreds or thousands just in those first few schools, the association kind of encouraged by one of our pastors, Jonathan Oldhorst at Wayatan in Rapid City, said, let's encourage congregations to hang up orange flags as a reminder every Sunday or throughout the week that we as a church are complicit, and that we as individual Christians and as a church corporately need to pray for this process and pray for Indigenous relatives who have been knowing this information and living with and trying and surviving what happened at boarding schools, both the survivor and the descendant, but also the re-traumatization as these, for those who never learned what happened to their relative, other than they just disappeared or they died. So there's an encouragement now to do that. I think, when hanging the orange flag, there's plenty of opportunity to learn about the history of boarding schools in this country. It's so funny. I talk about it like it's no big deal, but I worked for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. I was the board chair before that of that organization. My whole existence really is a boarding school story for 200 years. So that Moravian mission, as I said, my family was Moravian for 100 years. Well, that was because of a mission and from a boarding school. And then they left, and the Lutherans came, and that became a boarding school in the truest sense. Maybe they weren't as abusive and they weren't federally funded in the same way, but it was still an assimilative process, right? But all that to say, I speak about it like, it's just commonplace because it is for me and for most Native people. But, most folks that I've talked to over the last few years about boarding schools have no clue that it happened. And if they do, they certainly don't know that it was an actual federal policy that was funded by the millions, right, to churches and to run these boarding schools and to treat the children the way that they were treated. And so all of us who are Christian, Protestant and Catholic, are complicit. And so learn about boarding schools, hang the orange flag. I'll maybe in a comment to this YouTube, I will put in that letter for folks to check out, or on the Facebook event page as well. But the other thing that is important to note is that there's legislation that's been presented just in the last year by then Senator Holland, one of our first Native Congress people, right, for women in particular, and then Elizabeth Warren, and then Senator Holland becomes Secretary of the Interior, which is fantastic. And she immediately, because she's a descendant of, of boarding school, her mother and grandmother, creates an initiative to push it forward immediately to begin this investigation. And then more legislation is to come. And so a lot of that's targeted, will be targeted on the churches, right? So how the churches then also, not just about our government, how our government respond, but how the churches. And so I feel like we have a little bit of a head start because I have that experience and I'm passionate about it, the healing, the truth telling and the healing that needs to happen. So I just want all of us to be ready. So yes, hang the orange flag, become educated, because there are schools that might be preserved, but there might be a school in your backyard or that's in your church's history or that you helped fund, or somewhere in your generations was a part of that, right? So we talk about truth and healing. Truth is telling the story or knowing the story, and all of us have to know it, including non-natives, especially non-natives. And then we talk about healing, and friends of mine and I really kind of focused on that versus truth and reconciliation. A lot of times we abuse that word reconciliation. We think it's the end of something. It's an apology. We might do something, maybe something good, and then it's like, okay, we're good, we're absolved. When in fact, reconciliation is the beginning. Reconciliation is the act of responding to God's love and to God's grace. And we don't do that. We apologize and we think we're finished in regard to the social justice needs of Indian people and others. But for healing, it takes work. And it means scratching not just the surface, but digging deep to find out where the hurt comes from. And so, and a lot of folks are like, oh, well, Native people need to heal from their trauma, from boarding schools, from relocation into the cities, to the elimination of births or stealing of babies and adopting them out from Indian mamas, or from removal and taking from their land, right? And we're not just taking from our land; we're taking from our whole way of life, and our spiritual and our spiritual connection to the land and our ceremonies. But we have to heal as Indigenous people from all of that and all the trauma, even if we weren't there, right? We inherited it. It's in our DNA, literally. Then what do non-Native people, white people in particular, what do you need to heal from? So if we're carrying all this baggage of trauma in your generations, your families, and your churches, in your history as white people in this country, what do you need to heal from? And what does that healing look like? And what work do you have to do to get there? We can't work on reconciliation until we work on healing.
Well, and I appreciate you lifting up the Canada examples too, because they really have done this work for quite a long time. Like their government studied for years and years and years, kind of as a process of intentional reconciliation and healing. And that's why I think when you were saying that they're kind of steps ahead of us, is that what you were meaning, was that they had kind of tried to at least attempt to do some of that work for years?
They did incredible work. They did incredible. So it was what, I can't remember the exact year, but it ended about 6 or 7 years ago, the decade of truth and reconciliation. And it was totally focused on boarding schools and foster care. It was totally focused on how do we help discover how, our own complicity as Canadians in this atrocity that happened to our Indigenous peoples. And so for 10 years, it was a study. And then it was part of that process. And all this was mandated by, the federal government of Canada. They had to then bring in there was many of the survivors and descendants who wanted to come in, and they gave testimony. And we're talking thousands of people gave testimony. And there was like 10 different ways in which they could give testimony, whichever way it was most comfortable for them. It was all recorded. So as to never forget. We need a reminder that we're, crapping on our Native people. Well, here's a reminder, look what we did, right? And so that decade was phenomenal. And then of course they created beyond that, the Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which again is still focused on boarding school trauma for the most part, amongst other things maybe. But great work. And so some of the legislation that is being put forward it resembles some of that, but also gives us the freedom to kind of expand if we need to once legislation is passed. So the churches were forced in Canada during this decade to do the research on their own and to produce records. Any records that have to do with the annihilation or the abuse of any people at any level had to come from the congregations and the church bodies and denominations. And if there was a school, well, the denomination better get on it, find that information. I promise you, some of your congregations were a part of this situation in the United States. There's no way that there was that we weren't connected in the Lutherans, right? Lutherans had very few compared to others, but we still had some. Right, and Lutherans may have had only 2 that we know of federally funded schools, but we also had boarding schools that were not federally funded, and by the plenty. And so those are just as those schools are just as were just as harmful. We're just as complicit in that regard as if they were federally funded. And so we've got to do our research. So yeah, I'll be calling on a lot of folks to help me figure out where all these schools are and to tell the story so we begin healing, right? And we can begin exposing the hate that,
Well, and make sure that the information about Orange Shirt Day gets sent out. We'll send out to everyone on our newsletter list a copy of this video, but also the info on Orange Shirt Day and the information that y'all put out. I, of course, had a list of a whole bunch of other kind of gruesome topics that we could also cover. But I think, as you said, it's another lecture for another day. I want to lift up a question from our audience, which is a little maybe taking us back towards kind of the affirming stuff that's wonderful. So this is from Lisa. Loving this conversation. Can you explain more what you mean when you say medicine? I sort of get it, but I'm not quite sure.
You sounded kind of like Lisa when you read that question. So, hi, Lisa. I can't explain that, I suppose. So in the Western sense of the word medicine, only certain practitioners and certain folks with a long studied degree can produce medicine or practice medicine. And that comes in the form of surgery, or that comes in the form of diagnoses, or that comes in the form of prescribing a pill or some other sort of salve or something that creates healing. And those are all great things and important. And Native peoples, Indigenous peoples here and around the world also had similar practitioners, maybe not the same way, right? But certainly folks who created medicine from plants and in a different way, and maybe a more holistic or herbal, what we now call herbal way. And Native people would create medicine, but through ceremony and through water and through healing rituals. And so medicine came to us in those ways. But when I say medicine about certain things, right? So for instance, I will often say that my matriarchs, my mother and my grandmother and my great-grandmother and all my great-grandmother, my great-grandmother, and so on, that their medicine is because they passed down to me wisdom that helps me both heal from maybe the trauma or experiences I've had, or that they've passed down through DNA, and their medicine because they give me strength daily, even though they might not be with me. That's medicine. We say that medicine, laughter is medicine for us. And I think there's not a lot of Native people say that too now, but that really is medicine for us. The humor that is produced in any country is incredible. The laughter is loud and beautiful. And why that is medicine is because all of our trauma and all of our oppression, all we can do is laugh, right, to survive sometimes. And that gives us the release that we might need. That connects us together in this new spirit, so that can be medicine. Dance. When we have our powwows or we have our traditional ceremonies and there's dance involved or song involved or drum involved, for a lot of people that can be medicine. And for some it may not be. But for a lot of folks, they'll say that that's medicine because it's bringing healing, it's bringing community, it's bringing accountability, it's bringing connectedness and love, and just maybe if nothing else, this feeling of connection to Creator, to Mother Earth. Also, so medicine in the strictest sense in the Western culture means to practice it, to create it for the sake of healing the body. And I think there's a result for some folks that it also then helps heal other things like the spirit. But for us, medicine is always both. You can't heal one without the other. And so our medicine comes from a variety of places, both the physical, Mother Earth, our non-human sisters and brothers in the world, who sacrifice themselves for the sake of our medicine that goes into our body or goes on our body to heal the physical, but also then all those other elements of ceremonies and those non-human elements or human elements that are maybe not as tactile, that also then help heal our spirit, which is also part of then healing of the body. So medicine is defined, or medicine is used differently, I should say, a bit differently for Native Indigenous peoples around the world than it might be for folks who are from Western cultures.
Well, I think you are medicine for my life.
Thank you.
Just in terms of being someone who I always happen to like. We always happen to be like in the same space in very like interesting moments of like unique stress or busyness. And my favorite thing is that whenever we're near each other, there's this sense that like the whole world is super busy, but we're going to just stop and maybe be later to the airport than we think we might need to be to the airport. But like to just be able to kind of check in with each other kind of on a heart connection and to just be real with each other about where we are. And so I've always appreciated that by you. And if that's an accurate definition of medicine, then I would definitely say that I have experienced that kind of encountering you. I wonder if kind of since we're heading towards the end of the hour, and I want to respect your time, knowing that you're in a different time zone than I am in. would you be willing to talk about what it is? This is, I'm diverting wildly, but because I'm so excited that you are back working at Churchwide again, would you be willing to talk about what your role is at Churchwide and what it is you think you're up to and how we can be up to it with you?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for asking that. I get to be, like I said, the desk director of American Indian Alaska Native Tribal Nations, excuse me. But I sometimes get that wrong because the title has changed and the trajectory of the job has changed, and I'm grateful for that. Some years ago, the American Indian Alaska Native community, the leaders anyway, had said, you know, we think that maybe the church just doesn't have us in the right place. I think we're fine where we're at, but like we're really more of a global mission experience, and because we're sovereign nations, and we need to be interacting with our sovereign nations as if they're sovereign nations. When we talk about our congregations and ministries that are Indigenous, that are Native in the LCA, we also need to understand that those are folks who come to the table and to our church from a very different experience, as if they were coming from around the world. And as little as European Americans, European descent, white people, or even non-natives in general know about us, we really are in some ways considered foreign. And so if we could go, foreign thoughts about us, people know so little about us, right? And that's not okay. If we get to be placed in this global mission situation, then maybe folks will begin to understand that that's why we are perceived as different, because we are just that. We are different in a good and holy and beautiful way, in that we are sovereign nations, and that's what also makes us special and different as well in a good way. And so I will certainly continue the legacy of doing the work of supporting American Indian Alaska Native congregations and pastors and the association that exists for those congregations, and hopefully serving as a bit of a prayer giver and caretaker and journeyer with all of our pastors and leaders that are out there, and parishioners and others. I'll continue that like everyone else has done, but the other portion of the job, the larger portion of the job, is then figuring out how that we journey with, as healthily as possible, tribal nations. And so for those of you who don't know, there are 570 numbers changing, 572, I believe, or 73 federally recognized tribal nations in the United States. Almost half of them in Alaska, and there are tons of folks who can't make the grade according to the federal government, who are maybe or maybe not state recognized tribes or tribal groups, and then some that don't have either, but are certainly Indigenous. And so working through the church body to figure out how we then learn as much as we possibly can, but also journey together. I am oftentimes challenged because I sometimes think, man, I've worked with tribal nations in different ways, and tribal chairs and tribal councils and other leaders from Native nonprofits. I'm like, we've got a lot to learn from them. So to say that we're on a journey with them sounds pretty presumptuous. So I've got a lot of work to do to help reshape how we think about that journey with tribal folks these days, but also how we might encourage or maybe tempt some of those tribal nations to throw us a bone and help us out in regard to our learning and being better at being Christian when it comes to our relationship with Indigenous people. So there's a lot of room. And so a lot of folks say, what are you going to do? I'm like, no, it's not what I'm going to do. It's about what you're going to do, right? And so what are you going to do? But what I hope to be able to be about is give those tools, so those experiences, or those ways and those learnings, and those ways in which that congregational members, synod folks, right, whomever, churchwide staff can really enter into the work that needs to happen to rectify our relationship, to create some healing in between us, but also for ourselves individually. And then also recognize that we have a long way to go in doing that it's not just going to end anytime soon, but we're in it for the long game. And I'm ready for that, the long game. Let me do that. Let's just take our time and do it well. But I'm going to have a lot of work for everybody to do, because it can't just be me doing all this work, and it won't just be me doing this work. And so how do we empower one? And how do we bless everyone with the gift of learning how to be in a relationship, and a right relationship with Indigenous peoples, not for the sake of Indigenous peoples, for the sake of the church. So that's
and for the whole global community of the way that we try to be good stewards of our planet. Can you imagine we might have some things to learn about how to be better stewards of our planet?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'm so thankful you say that. And I'm thankful you guys says that, because it's like, I've been saying for a while, we have to center Indigenous wisdom in this work of creation justice and healing of our relationship with Mother Earth and our non-human relatives who, again, sacrifice themselves for our well-being, and they folks just have it. I mean, Indigenous folks around the world, what is it? I think I read the statistic just this morning, right? 5% of the population is Indigenous internationally in the world, and yet we protect 60% of the biodiversity and 6% of Mother Earth, and working to figure out how we get to protect more. And it's this constant for us. Not every Native, but most of us are like, how do we get more? How do we protect more? And it's like we can't figure out why nobody else is catching on. I mean, certainly there are, right? We get that, but like not as many as we need to catch on to the fact that Indigenous peoples have this gift to give of wisdom, to do better and to love Mother Earth. And a lot of it, funny enough, is spiritual. It's not all just practical stuff. It is spiritual and understanding our relationship with our mother and with our non-human relatives out there. So yeah.
Well, I hear you saying that you're going to help make us ambassadors. Not necessarily like, definitely not making us missionaries, right? Definitely, maybe not making us disciples, because it's not about trying to trade medicine for Jesus, right? It's about honoring the stories and the ways that people are in the world. And it's about, I'm trying to, I think, create authentic relationships on the one hand, and then do the generational work that we need to help untangle ourselves from the stuff that we have been too untangled in, both from what we've done and from what we've left undone. And then ways that we can, join in the care of creation and hopefully increase and improve that and learn stories. And when it's our turn to hand over documents, if we have documents, we have to.
Yeah. Well, it's so funny. I love that you're listing all these things for me. I'm glad this is being recorded, so I'm just going to take some notes.
Yeah, there you go. We'll do some bullet points.
The other thing that you reminded me, though, is, that I want to share before I leave, is that I also have a nonprofit where I do cultural immersion and cultural education called Otherwise, and been doing it for a long time, both at LSTC and before then. And it's a really great program. We do it in Denver, urban Denver, and then Portland, Texas, and it's really great program in my opinion. But I have a lot of great supporters and people who help me do this through program partners and everybody else. Kenna, who's our program director, and others. But the one thing that I always often mention to the young people that join us, but also then to the pastors and youth directors and the parents that are also coming along this journey with the young people, is, we're not making missionaries out of you. All we're doing is looking to teach you how to build good, first of all, ask good and effective questions, and for the sake of understanding how to build good relationships, good and healthy relationships with people who are different than you. Not other, right, but different. And then on top of that, do not come to my community to do mission, no matter what your definition of mission is, if you can't do mission well in your own community. Only when I see that you're doing mission well in your own community should you attempt to come and learn more about how to do it well in your own community from us.
So you all don't want the books that aren't, they're outdated for us? You don't want us to send them? No?
The 1997 confirmation resources I worked on.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I don't want those. And and there's something to be said for a little bit of service in healthy ways, right? Something to be said for charity for folks, but there are people who need service and charity in your own community. And there are people across the world that need it too, and there's certainly healthy ways to do that. But do it right, and the way in which you do that right is to first learn about whom you're giving to, and why it's important, and not just, oh, those are people, brown or black or queer or homeless or poor people that need our charity. It's got to be deeper than that. And in some instances, maybe the churches are doing it, but it doesn't ever feel like it. But the reason I know that is because it happened to me in my community year after year after year after year, and day after day after day. And then don't bring us Jesus. And I don't mean that we don't love Jesus, because most of us have been assimilated enough to love Jesus a lot. What I'm saying is we already got Jesus, right? And so come and just be with us and learn from us. And that's kind of where otherwise came from. It's that from the indigenous experience of this mission culture that the church has been about for 100+ years, right? Of, oh, we've killed all the Indians, or we've Christianized all the Indians and black people, so now we're going to go help the poor people, who are then the black and Indian people, right? Or the brown people. And now the homeless and the queer, right? Or whomever. Okay, great. But for the last 100 years, we have been entering these communities in a way that just doesn't fit. And I've seen it. It doesn't fit. And so the wisdom that you need, that privileged people need, are what comes from the margins. Because we've had to survive and navigate in ways that you don't know how to survive and navigate. We understand Jesus because Jesus was where we are, right? Jesus was tribal as well, right? And so my lens, right? But then also I will say that we have this opportunity to understand how to see ourselves as the other. If we're entering into someone else's space or place, or even if it's over generations, we've entered into someone else's space or place, we're the other. Don't go to someone else's community and say, oh, you're the other, right? And so, and allow for us to do our hospitality, allow for us to show you how to do it well too, because that's also a beautiful gift that I think Indigenous peoples practice and are able to share with other people as well. But I could do this all day long, so we should probably go on to something else.
Well, it's just a sign that we should do it again. I would love to have regular check-ins with you if you would be up for it, because, you know, I've been a bishop for 61 days.
Yeah. Great.
And so in our 61 days, I can acknowledge and confess that we do not have, or at least I do not have, authentic relationships with the local Native folk who live in our synod, especially not even enough to invite folk that we have relationship for long terms and periods with to do welcomes at ceremonies. And so just being public and authentic about needing to learn with you and have you guide us and poke us. And so my commitment always is that I won't ask congregations to do work the synod has not yet done. And so I don't feel like I can ask all of the congregations to go and do all of this stuff because the synod has not done it yet. And so I say it publicly so that both you know that I'm committed to it, and others can roll back this reel and say, you said you were going to do it and you didn't do it. And they'll be right if I don't do it. Right. Yeah. And so I am delighted that you're in your role at Churchwide, because it means that I'm not just pestering you, I'm helping you do your job when I contact you. But I'm committed to being a better person in relationship with those who have dwelt on these lands longer than us, and finding ways that we can share our responsibility in caring for the earth, and find ways to remember the correct day to wear an orange shirt or to raise an orange flag, and to be able to even one of my favorite things is to lift up theologians who embody the fuller diversity of this full globe and this full space that we live in. And so I think you already know that I adore you, but my hope is that you will be given all the resources you need to help us and to walk with us and to be with us. And so thank you again for joining us here in this space.
Yeah, thank you, Bishop. And I'm looking forward to the day. It's exciting that we have you being the leader that we need you to be in the place where we need you most. So thank you for accepting that call.
Fantastic. And we will look forward to hearing from you next time.
Sounds good.
All right.